But anyway, but he seems to be offering or opening up the idea that our moral obligations to land, air, water, wildlife emerged biologically, but in a different way, okay? In a different way than moral norms about these human entities emerged. So we would expect Collicutt to give some account of that different way in which our moral obligations to ecological wholes emerge. Because traditionally, right, whatever obligations we have to these, take a forest, right? We don't have obligations to the forest except insofar as we want to maximize human benefit to it. We have obligations to humans. And it may be the case that preserving that old growth forest does maximize human benefits. But if it doesn't, then, right, then all the moral norms that evolve to deal with human beings would instruct us, actually, it's a good idea to go do some timber harvest in that old growth forest, right? Because those timber harvests benefit all these people that we know we have moral obligations to, right? So anyway, it may be difficult for us to defend a land ethic the way that Collicutt proposes, all right? And that would be my overall criticism of Collicutt. It's not my criticism. There's been a lot of work in the last 15 years or so. Collicutt did most of his work in the late 70s, throughout the 80s, and then throughout the 90s, and then kind of since then he's been busily trying to defend his work against critics. But a lot of criticisms have emerged of Collicutt's whole interpretation of Leopold and his reconstruction of the land ethic. And that's where I get all, most of what I'm going to offer you here today. But first we have to try to understand Humean moral psychology, okay? Humean moral psychology is the key to understanding Collicutt's reconstruction of the land ethic. And these are really, you might have, I want you to think ahead a little bit here, and always, for this class, remember that Humean moral psychology serves the role for the Neo-Humeans that Kant's metaphysics of morals serves for the Neo-Kantians. And notice the whole language is different, right? Moral psychology, right, versus metaphysics of morals. So the best way to approach these two very broadly different ways of doing moral philosophy is to think of them as very broadly different stories, with all the elements of stories that are very different, right, from the very beginning to the end. All these elements, right, that's how stories are. Or songs, right, works of art. They all have their own integrity and their own beginning points, right? And philosophers spend a lot of time, debating about which beginning point is the wisest beginning, the best, the most suitable, right? Even that, how do you even frame that question? Where do you start? Which is most suitable? Which works? Which is metaphysically the most accurate, the most correct? How do you explain what that might be, right? Anyway, these are two broadly different stories, okay? And the Neo-Humeans rely on this Humean moral psychology, whereas the Neo-Kantians rely on a Kantian metaphysics of morals. And they're just very different accounts of moral norms, right? And including all three elements, really. I mean, except axiologically. Axiologically, they both can jump all over the place, okay? You can be a Neo-Humean in every quadrant, you can be a Neo-Kantian in every quadrant, right? But you can't be, well, let me make sure I get this, well, okay, let me just back up, just keep going with my lecture notes here. The Neo-Kantians, of course, are non-consequentialists. They have a much more objectivistic meta-ethic. The Neo-Kantians are all right, I'm just going to get back to my lecture notes here. And maybe I should just expand these out. We've got about 10 minutes before we'll take our break. So for Collicutt, Leopold is all these things. And note the differences, the most important fundamental difference from Norton's Leopold, right? Norton's Leopold is at the very least strategically, maybe that's what Norton wants to say, you know, he's just being, that's what he means by weakly anthropocentric. Okay, strategically, that's what the land manager ought to do. Organize his land management decisions around the long-term interests of the human community. And those are the reasons to cite for explaining why you have chosen this course of action as a land manager, right? Why you say this is the right course of action, right? If you're a Nortonian Leopoldian, then it's the right course of action because in your studied, well-developed empirical understanding, it is the course of action which is going to lead to the most benefits for the long-term human community. Okay? If you're a and the outcome's going to be the same. Norton would further go on to point out, right? He's going to trot out his convergence hypothesis and say that the same policies which the more than anthropocentrists are advocating are also being advocated, the same exact ones. They're both radical sets of policy proposals. They rethink everything, right, by the anthropocentrists, okay? But Collicutt says, well, Leopold said more than that. He was a more than anthropocentric thinker, and even though I agree, maybe the convergence hypothesis is, you're onto something there, Mr. Norton, but the truth is that Leopold was concerned about ecological values for non-anthropocentric reasons. And so the best description of Leopold is as a more than anthropocentric. He recognized moral status and urged us to assign legal status to, right? Because he recognized moral status in Wolf Pack. He urged governments to assign legal protections to them, right? And he urged governments to abolish their predator eradication programs. The mature Leopold, right, urged governments to abolish their predator eradication programs and adopt legal protections. Why? According to Collicutt, not just because it's in long-term human interest. That would be Norton's answer, right? According to Collicutt, it's because, darn it, they do. They just have their own kind of moral status. Okay? They have their own kind of moral considerability, all right? And that means that, if Collicutt's correct, then that means that Leopold is a more than anthropocentric thinker, okay? So in the moment with the wolf, of course, Collicutt identifies as that moment where he becomes a more than anthropocentric thinker. Okay, and the heart of that is that he insists, first of all, that not only individuals but communities too are, and that's something Norton agrees with also, right? This basic idea that communities are also. Norton says Leopold's big shift was not toward more than anthropocentrism. Leopold's big shift was just toward holism, right? But still an anthropocentric holism. Collicutt says no, he turned toward a more than anthropocentric form of holism. And it does seem that his, right? I mean, I've urged you in your exams, for example, in your midterm exam, I just urged you to remember this is a very simple, it seems overly strong, right? And you want to think, you want to cringe a little bit away from it and think, you know, he can't mean that. You know, that means we're really screwed up and our managers have just made mistakes all over the place, right? And you might think it's impractical or it's imprudent and no ethicist could possibly, you know, but that reminds me, though, to a point I've meant to bring out, that I have yet to bring out, is that we're not looking for the answer in a moral philosophy class. Okay, we just aren't, and we're not looking for the right answer to a moral struggle. Okay, but what that does, though, by admitting that right out front, that frees us to separate out prudential considerations from moral philosophical considerations. Okay? And we're just free to follow down these follow through this path, this journey of moral philosophy, without being distracted by prudential considerations. That way we climb the mountain, you know, we climb the mountain of enlightenment, right? Which is what we all want to do, and we're not just constantly looking around and saying, well, that's not realistic. And yeah, sure, it probably isn't. It's not prudential, okay? But what you do after you take a moral philosophy class in conjunction with dozens of other classes in empirical, right? And this is not, you're not studying what is the case here. You're studying You're asking normative questions, right? And the knowledge you're getting here is very different. Very, very different and unfamiliar and bizarre, kind of in a way. If you think that the scientific model of knowledge is the model, right, then this doesn't seem like very much like knowledge, right? But anyway, studying this material, it seems, is very important to reaching the answer, to reaching a final answer about how we ought to resolve any given moral struggle, right? But we're not going to answer the moral struggles here. And that's why, you know, we always want to just be polishing up our moral compass, right? That's what we're doing. We're going through polishing our moral compass, just seeing what's in there. And asking more questions, right? Sometimes there's a lens behind the lens, and we have to polish up that other lens first, you know, and we have to find out what's at issue there before we can, anyway, you got my drift. So never confuse, that's just another reminder, never confuse moral philosophical thinking with prudential thinking, the different kinds of thinking. And in the end, you have to do them both, right? Obviously, you have to make your way in the world. With both, right? With a normative, with the normative part of your gait, you know, as you walk through the world, and then with an empiricist, a scientist part. And prudence means, you know, you have to draw on all that too, but it's different than moral philosophy. Anyway, okay, so Collicutt talks a little bit. He tries to defend himself a little bit against it. Did you guys read about eco-fascism in the essay I asked you to read? Yes, no?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah. Yeah.
Didn't you?
Yeah.
That's what I thought. Okay, because I changed the reading at some point, and I know that in one reading he uses that term, and they make the same general arguments in one. Okay. Anyway, so according to Collicutt, this is a long time ago, right? Maybe in the early 1980s, you might have heard on Rush Limbaugh program or something. You might have heard this chart, you know, those eco-fascists, they just want to control, you know, how we use natural resources. And anyway, people throw that word out, and Collicutt, I guess, is a little bit concerned and just wants to dispose of it right away. And so the key to disposing of that accusation, getting rid of it once and for all, is to point out that, according to Collicutt, the land ethic does not obligate us, okay, to act contrary, that it's consistent. It's not inconsistent. It doesn't obligate us to act contrary to. So, according to this reading of Leopold, and I think, right, this basic reading makes perfect sense. Leopold's not saying that we should replace all previous ethics with the land ethic dominated by his highfalutin formula about the biotic community, right? It would seem then that we would have to sacrifice part of our humanistic moral structure, right? And so Collicutt just said, no, that's wrong. We don't have to sacrifice any part of our traditional anthropocentric understanding of our moral obligations, okay? Nothing about that needs to be sacrificed. They supplement each other, okay? Think of it as just another circle of moral obligation. And he says that our obligations to the more, what he calls the more venerable and intimate communities. And think of those as the tighter circles in the ring of concentric obligations, right? The tighter circles, he says, yeah, we do have more obligations to those entities in those more venerable, within the tighter circles of community, right? The human families, towns, cities, right? We do have greater moral obligations to them than to the wider. They're encompassing and they're fundamental because, right, all of this is nested within ecosystems, right? But as long as what we're doing here is not in, is okay ecologically, then yes, we have all these still, and they take precedence and they're very important, right? And he would, the more recently emerged, I know that sounds an odd way of saying it, but actually it's consistent with Collicutt. So he does recognize these obligations to ecological wholes have recently emerged, right? They weren't there before, but in an enlightened 20th and 21st century society, they've emerged, right? They're also more impersonal, right? Because they're not persons. You don't have personal relationships with the entities in the biotic community rather than the human entities. So Collicutt thinks that given Leopold's general approach, general description of how the land ethic evolves, Collicutt says that really you should consider the land ethic in conjunction with these two second-order principles. All right? I know it gets a bit confusing, but SOP means second-order principle, and there are two of them. What is the first-order principle? Everybody. A
thing is right.
That's the first-order principle. That, if spread out all the way and taken to its logical conclusions, leads to eco-fascism, right? And snipers on all the bridges in Portland, just picking off all the litterers. All those damn drunks, you know, introducing their own hypothetical imperative, you know. It is morally permissible to throw my beer bottles in the river when I'm too drunk to stumble up the bank, right? Bam! Right? The hell with that. Anyway, right? If you're an eco-fascist, right? I mean, not just that. Obviously, the coal companies and all these frackers and drillers, they would just be eliminated, right? If that was our only principle, right? Because these things are obvious. These things are totally inconsistent with the ongoing viability and health of of all of our ecosystems, right? All this fracking and drilling that we're doing, pumping all this stuff into the atmosphere, it's totally. So anyway, it seems as though if that's all Leopold offers us, then, you know, we're either going to go radical environmentalist all the way and just shut down industrial society completely and just throw in our hats with the earth firsters, right? Or, you know, or we're just going to kind of throw in the towel and say, well, we might as well just try to make a fast buck, you know, try to be comfortable and get a big house and TV and stuff. Anyway, but so fortunately, we have recourse. We're not stuck with such a stark alternative because Collicutt unlocks for us these second-order principles within the land ethic, okay? And these help sort through our moral struggles, okay? And keep in mind these moral struggles that Collicutt himself invites us to consider, especially the Northwest old-growth forest quandary, because that's close to home, right? It's a little bit old now. It's odd to think of this as being an old moral struggle, but this drew a lot of attention in popular media throughout the 80s and 90s, right? And Clinton and Al Gore had a big Northwest Forest Summit right here in Portland. And about shortly after, is one of the first things that Bill Clinton did when he was elected president in early '93 or summer of '93. They had a big Northwest Forest Council. Anyway, and they had to, as a result of pressure, because of the listing of the spotted owl under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, a lot of U.S. Forest Service land and Bureau of Land Management, a lot of federal land ended up being set aside as part of a legally required recovery plan for the spotted owl, right? So all these things automatically, you know, kick into place when a species gets listed, including a recovery plan. And so then that recovery plan has to be consistent with the best available science, right? Which is where you get all kinds of lawsuits. And then sadly enough, in our broken down system, the moral struggles end up getting settled finally by a judge where they really shouldn't be settled. But the judge ends up having to hear all the testimony from the bogus scientists offered by the revolving door lobbyists who works for the Forest Service, you know, and then the judge has to sit there and listen to all that bogus science from the prostitutes, whatever they myostitutes, right? That's what they're called, myostitutes. And then the judge has to listen to the crunchy granola scientists who work for hardly anything at all, who volunteer their time at the local, you know, can't even afford their car payment. You know, and then has to listen, but at least they've got some legitimate science, right? And they're doing their dream job, you know, right out of law school, working for for nothing, right? Anyway, but that's not where these issues should be resolved, right? We shouldn't have agencies of the federal government that are so thoroughly co-opted and corrupted by anti-enlightenment, right? That's the post-enlightenment society, right? The pre-enlightenment society is the Catholic Church having its tentacles in every, right, economically, politically, every aspect of our society is structured, right, through this institution, right? And now, every aspect, of course, who are the high priests, right? USA. They're not really priests, they're just economists, right? The guys wearing the suits, right? Really, it's the computer programs making the decisions about, about how most efficiently to advance profits. Anyway, but in the old days, when we still had environmental battles in the Northwest, we worried about the spotted owls, and on the other side, the loggers worried about jobs, right? And so, and we could multiply our examples though, right? I like to throw out some other examples, like the dolphin slaughter is more extreme, right? Because it involves dolphins, right? But it's another harvest, right? And then here in the Northwest, we have the harvest of old growth timber versus the protection of spotted owls, of the species. And Collicutt thinks that application of Leopold's first order principle combined with application of second order principles 1 and 2 will result in the conclusion that we ought to protect in the Northwest, and setting aside enough forest lands of the right age timber, right? Those owls need, they need open timber, right? And you only find that in old growth forests, places where that's how they evolved, right? They evolved to fly around underneath the canopy, and that's why they're going extinct. But Collicutt may be wrong about that. Notice how all of these steps require judgments. They require the exercise of judgment by the person who's relying on them. These aren't scientific formulas, right? You can't just plug in. You have to exercise your own judgment in each case. And of course, Collicutt's kind of heavily weighted the whole debate toward, because we know what he means by stronger interests, right? He's an environmentalist, and when he says stronger interest, he means the vital interests of biotic communities. Okay, and so the only way in Collicutt's, if we apply these two principles, the only way to defend any action that leads to violation of first order principle, right? That's redrafted by Collicutt. Notice Collicutt's redrafting of Leopold's first order principle. A thing is right when it tends to disturb the biotic community only at normal spatial and temporal scales, right? And that means scales, temporal and spatial scales that do not destroy the biotic community's capacity to renew itself. So the only way to justify an action which violates this principle, according to Collicutt, is with reference to vital human needs. Okay, and that's a very high hurdle, right? That's a huge hurdle to have to cross, which means again, Collicutt's sitting there from his environmentalist armchair saying he's got it. He's defended the very, very strong environmental policies, right? Because we can only harm an ecological whole. We can only harm any aspect, right? I think the three big aspects of the ecological whole. If you want, you can set aside beauty and then right? Integrity, stability. We can only harm any aspect of the whole if we can justify it by pointing exactly which vital human needs are being met. Okay? So, boom, there go all the dams on the Columbia, all the dams on the Snake, right? There go all kinds of things that we do because, and then you might think, well, what good is that? Anyway, and then that's when you go and you take a course in economics and you figure it all out after taking all these other courses, right? But this is the very stringent test that Collicutt's Leopold offers us. And it does result in, but I want to point out one other thing before we take a break, just real quickly though, all right? Before we get, and then we come back, we'll focus in on Humean moral psychology, get a little more philosophical. I wanted to point out that while the Leopoldians probably have some strong arguments against the dolphin roundup, at Taiji Cove. I think an average, and somebody can always correct me on these facts, but I think on average they harvest 200 to 300 dolphins in an average year, and they do it a lot. A lot of those are harvested at one time, right? They herd them all in to this cove, and then they trap them in there. They can't leave. Some of them are selected for sale to amusement parks like SeaWorld, and then some of them are, and then most of them are just slaughtered and sold actually as some other kind of meat on the market. But that's, of course, many people who see that movie, The Cove, and who are concerned about this issue are particularly drawn to this issue because the subject is a dolphin, the dolphins, and the sophistication, emotional and intellectual sophistication of the dolphin is what kind of pulls our hearts, right? Draws on our heartstrings for a lot of us. But just observe that for a Leopoldian, the Leopoldian could also be an animal rights guy, and then he could put on a different cap, right? But for a Leopoldian, in a different context, he can go write a check for, the animal rights liberation that's going to save the dolphins that are being exploited, or get that poor orca, that elderly matriarch. What on earth is she doing? She's in Florida, being held hostage by this giant corporation when her relatives are all over here in Puget Sound, and they would recognize her and welcome her. Just like those wolves in the wolf pack that Uncle Aldo shot at, right? They welcome her, obviously. Anyway, that just seems horrible. It just seems morally wrong. I don't know why they don't at least try. But that's a whole different set of arguments, okay? Because the Leopoldian is just going to ask whether or not that harvest of 200 to 300 dolphins per year is consistent, is compatible with the marine ecosystem's capacity to renew itself, right? So we don't really know. I mean, I suspect that seems like kind of a high number. Dolphins are an apex predator, right? They're kind of like a wolf, aren't they? Aren't dolphins sort of wolves in the ocean? They're very good athletes. They're very good hunters, right? And they're carnivores. So yeah, they're apex predators. And we know that apex predators play a vital role in all wherever they are found. That's why they're there, because they play a vital role, right? The ecosystem, the equilibrium, the stability and integrity of the ecosystem developed with predators. So you take them away and all kinds of things start to go awry, right? All little things start falling apart. So, but if it turns out, if you do the study, right, study it real carefully, and it turns out that no, that's perfectly consistent. There are thousands of these dolphins out there, and harvesting 200 or 300 a year is perfectly consistent with what the ecosystem can sustain. Then the Leopoldian is going to say, my work is done, and that's going to be that. Okay? You guys follow that? All right. So don't imagine that just because it's a Leopoldian land ethic that it's going to be all touchy-feely with the dolphins. Okay? It's going to treat the dolphins the same way it treats the deer, the same way it treats the wolf, the same way it treats, we want to manage them with an eye toward the integrity and stability of the whole. And whether it's a touchy-feely dolphin or some disgusting venomous spider or whatever, we want to manage them all with the same idea in mind. Okay? All right, so let's take our 5-minute break and come back shortly before 1:10 after. All right? We'll move on to our moral psychology.
Watching this program yesterday on how they're doing all the freeways and highways up in Montana and putting bridges on it, like natural bridges where all the wolves back going into the Yellowstone and whatnot, and they're trying to do it all the
Good
way,
idea.
all the way from Canada to, they want it to go all the way into, for the genetics, you know, like we're talking because they were scared that, yeah, you spend all this money on big, huge parks, but those parks need to be intertwined amongst each other to
Good wildlife
conserve,
corridors, yeah.
to conserve the biodiversity of the genes.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I have your email, yeah, thanks. Oh, no, just, you missed the last one too, Steve? Okay, it's just one business. Okay, everyone needs to sign things on Tuesday too. No, just way back there. After people get back, you can start it around.
Yeah, so there was,
Yeah,
so
there's a
there
lot
was,
of controversy about that, you know, about the wildlife moving on and off, moving off. You know, when the bison go off Yellowstone, when they leave the boundaries of the park, when they bound it up, and they get held in a tube where they get tested for brucellosis. And then, I don't think any of them are let go. Those that have brucellosis are just slaughtered.
right,
And then I think those that are healthy are just sent back. But,
yeah, they were talking about the wolf population, how it was really coming up again, but they were doing statistical analysis of them, and they were like, hey, we need at least 1,000 different types of wolves to keep the population, because if not, it's just gonna be a bunch of inbreeding amongst the wolf population. So yeah, it's gonna be a bunch of wolves, but they're gonna be really sick, they're not gonna live prosperous, so they're trying to connect all these forests from here all the way to Canada and into
to restore the normal wolf migrations,
That
and
was-
disperse their genes.
it was a NOVA,
Yeah.
it was a
Uh-huh.
on OPV program I was keeping out.
Yeah, that story of those wolves on Isle Royal is almost unbelievable. Really. A lot of my stories, I think people don't believe me. They think, he's talking about some thylacine, you know, what is that? That doesn't even exist, right? That's actually a cryptid, you know, that's achieved the status among folklorists, I guess, or people who study these things. Has achieved the status, the same status as the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot. These are all cryptids. And so the thylacine is a cryptid. There are periodic sightings, not only on Tasmania, but throughout the mainland. They used to exist on the mainland, but evidently they were driven out when the Aboriginal Australians started bringing more and more dogs. I guess they competed. That's probably why they went extinct on the mainland about 3,000 years ago. But now they exist, and then they did exist, and they were very healthy though, right, on Tasmania. They hunted those Tasmanian emus, which are also extinct. Another subspecies of emu which is extinct. So, but yeah, they need to